Hello again, and welcome to the next episode in the American National Catholic Church's Renewing the Spirit podcast. Today, Father Kerry has joined me again, has agreed again for a discussion focusing on Catholic social teaching. So the title of this particular episode is From Faith to Action. And one of the reasons that I thought we might want to explore a little bit of Catholic social teaching was an observation that Father Kerry made regarding perhaps maybe the lack of exposure of Catholic social teaching, both to Catholic communities, to ourselves as Christians, and maybe to our brothers and sisters who are worship in a different way. And so today I thought we'd begin a discussion about, or at least maybe point out some of the principles of Catholic social teaching, which may lay the basis for us as Christians in terms of our ethical behavior, our moral behavior, and maybe in some of our turbulent times, they might provide a real roadmap for us in terms of how to respond in Christian charity towards the disability that we're experiencing in our country today. So I was thinking that Father Kerry, who is a retired professor of philosophy from Gettysburg, actually the Bittinger chair there, would be the most appropriate guest to have. And so I don't know if you want to add or say anything to that, Father Kerry.
I'm just delighted to be here because it does seem to me that Catholic social teaching is a well-kept secret in too many circles.
Yes.
It's been my experience that secularists tend to think that Christianity really doesn't have much to offer when it comes to social problems, that all we do is point the finger and rant and rave. And there's some justification for that, I suspect. But I've also discovered that with some of our Christian sisters and brothers, religion has become kind of privatized. It's a relationship between me, the individual, and God, and that sin likewise has been thought of as privatized. All I'm concerned about is my own sinful life and how it affects my relationship with God. And so what's missing, it seems to me, is the appreciation that, at least in my opinion, Christianity is a genuine humanism. In the tradition, we call it the integral humanism, right? And that's because it integrates the individual and God with the community. It recognizes that individuals sin, but communities sin too if they embrace structures of evil. It embraces the welfare and the goodness of the body and embodiment, but also the welfare and goodness of spiritual development. And so it seems to me that social teaching in the Catholic tradition is birthed by that integral humanism that tries to embrace all of what it means to be a human being.
Yes, I think that's a very nice frame that you that you actually put on that, because I think in this day of rugged individualism revisited, I guess, in some ways, right? That this idea that is me, God alone, and then in some ways, how does that then affect my behavior and my encounter with the community that I move in? And I couldn't help but to think, as you were talking, in so many ways, that our faith is inherited from people who so appreciated the value of community and how that shaped behavior, and how that then our participation in that social commerce also shaped that community in real and meaningful ways. And I do think that maybe you and I have inherited that that Protestant kind of Puritan work ethic, in a sense of the Pelagianism, right? That we somehow earn our own salvation, and it's just between me and God. And so I love the way that you posit that. And Catholic social teaching, actually, at least I think in historically a contemporary review of maybe the first attempt to codify Catholic social teaching in a corpus of literature or work or encyclicals, was with De Rerum Novarum, and in which Pope Leo actually spoke into exactly some of the frame that you put on this, right? Like how how are we contributing members of our society? How are we balancing work with, with recognizing the value and the dignity of the human person? We read in scripture that the labor is worth their hire. And so the first articulation of this was really speaking in terms of, I think, the whole church's awareness of some of these injustices that were occurring. And so I do think that beginning to introduce again that we are members of society and community allows us, I think, a greater sense of maybe framing it the way that you did. So, yeah.
I think that's really well said, Bishop. And as you were speaking, I was reminded of the prophetic tradition as well. I mean, the
Yeah.
prophets are constantly talking about the communal covenant with God,
Yes.
constantly reminding us of the inherent dignity of human beings, constantly reminding us to look out, well, what the Catholic tradition would call to exercise a preferential option for the poor, the widow
Right.
and the orphan.
Yeah.
So just, the thing that I just love about Catholic social teaching, not only the encyclicals, like the Reverend Natura that you just mentioned, but it's so biblical. It's
Yeah. It's
absolutely
absolutely
biblical.
biblical. Yes, absolutely. I do think I do think that when I was thinking about us, you and I joining about this today, joining together to discuss this today, I was thinking about how often the criticism sometimes of Catholics is that we're not
Yeah.
scripturally rooted, and I cannot agree with you more. If you think about the communal nature of the wandering tribe who depended on each other for protection and sustenance, and now how God acts in human history in such important ways to maybe add purpose to these communal events. I think here in the neighborhood in which we live, it's Orthodox Jewish, and so it is in a sense a community-based religion. Like the worship of God is done in community. I think for us as Catholics, during COVID and after, people stopped going to church. But what I always encourage people is that you have to come and have some of the rough edges rubbed off by people sitting next to you, right, shoulder to shoulder. But I can't. And by the way, Father Kerry, I kind of know what to think as you're talking too. That not only is it biblical, but the prophets also were communicating to the people of Israel really important messages about the use and distribution of resources.
Yes.
And so we read all of the time, if you have two tunics, give one to someone else. Like we're this concept of sharing, this concept of the meaningful nature of how our living together requires that we pay attention to the needs of the others. And I think Catholic social teaching really does highlight that for us in so many ways. And by the way, we have some great stars of that. We have Mother Teresa. We have people who so allowed the influence of the scripture to influence their life in such a way that they changed the world. So yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of Dorothy Day, for instance, in the American,
Yes. Yeah.
or the Berrigan brothers.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
absolutely, right? And that's the other thing. I think that when we talk about Catholic social teaching, we're not simply talking about a social dimension of the gospel absent of our understanding of this God who created the universe and saw that it was good, that there's essential goodness. And then these principles of subsidiarity, the dignity of the human person, the idea that we should stand in solidarity with the widow, the widow, the alien, and the orphan, the actual preferential option for the poor. I do think this sounds alien in people's ears,
Yeah.
right? What do you mean a preferential option for the poor? Like,
Yeah.
what about me? What about my stocks? What about?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You know what I've discovered is, and I'm sympathetic with this as a retired working
Uh-huh.
pastor, but a lot of my pastor friends now, when I talk to them about Catholic social teaching, say, you know what? It's everything that I have to take care of one-on-one, the people who come to me for help. I completely get that and I
Yes.
applaud that. But
Yeah.
it's not a zero-sum game,
Mm,
It seems to me that part of what it means to be a disciple of Christ is to care for people on a one-to-one basis, but also in keeping with Catholic social teaching, to be concerned about the common good.
Yes.
Because if the common good begins to unravel, all of the one-on-one ministry that we do is going to be thereby diminished.
Yes. 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 No, go on. Continue.
And so it does seem to me then that what we need to do is to, as best we can, everybody has different circumstances, everybody has different strengths and weaknesses. I don't want to deny that whatsoever. But as best we can, we need to recognize that in somehow working for the greater good, working for social justice, we really do impact the individual people whom we minister to. Just one other point on that, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
What we're looking for is justice. That's the key word here, right? We're looking for justice,
Yeah.
which is not antithetical to charity, to individual acts of love. And there's at least two kinds of justice that we pay attention to. We pay attention, of course, to distributive justice, which is what you were mentioning, talking about earlier, Bishop. The prophetic distribution of goods in a fair, just way. But we also talk about commutative justice, and that's the sort of justice that pertains on the interpersonal basis between individuals. How do I respect the rights of others? Not just their individual needs, but their rights.
Oh,
Or work for their rights.
Yeah. Boy, this is so timely in terms of the influences that would run counter to that, right? So that unless you believe what I believe, your beliefs are completely discounted, right? Or this, and as you were speaking, this kind of communal justice is really something for us to reappropriate again, right? In terms of how do we, I think, embedded in Catholic social teaching, is embedded in the principle of the dignity of the human person. How do we allow them the fullness of that dignity to believe how they believe, to act in accord with the norms of society? Because I never forget when I was in theology studying, the Jesuits, I think, were such generous people, as I've said, in terms of their education. But I remember a professor in particular talking about the social structure and what economically and socially might keep that running. But what about the theological underpinnings of that society, right? Like what are those? And I think you're touching on that. It is this idea of letting people to be fully who they are in terms of who God created them to be, and how do we respect that? How do we protect that? Right? I mean, in so many, and so I think that, as you say, the Catholic social teaching really does maybe give us a cognitive and a moral and a spiritual roadmap to engage human commerce, with an eye towards something maybe something greater than ourselves in the moment, right? So yeah.
That's beautifully said.
Yeah.
I really resonate with that. I can't remember the name of the encyclical, but it came out in '82. It's one of John Paul II's encyclicals, in which he makes a distinction between development and progress when it comes to social justice. And one of the things he argues, if I remember correctly, in that encyclical, is that it's important to focus upon material conditions. No one wants to deny that. But we also have to figure out what will maximize the being of individuals, the very way in which individuals exist. And that calls for maybe this integral humanism that I mentioned earlier, this appreciation that we're embodied creatures, but we're also spiritual creatures, and justice needs to speak to both of those dimensions, as you just said.
I think you're referring to John Paul II, Evangelium Vitae, which is the gospel of life, right? And such an important point, because for us, in so many ways, this idea of body, mind, and spirit, right, it's probably an ancient thought. It probably certainly predates modern psychology in terms of how we understand it, but it is this alignment of all of those things in such a way that can result both in our good and the common good.
Yes.
And then I think John Paul II, he does kind of help us balance. Again, it's kind of maybe it is Old Testament in a sense. In the sense, to me, it feels very biblical. That that almost what you hoard to yourself, right, becomes what
Mm,
destroys you. And
mm,
and and and
mm,
then so we see in that, I think, the element of greed, or
hmm.
does that make sense? I think,
Makes a
yeah,
lot of sense. I quite
yeah,
like
yeah,
it. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah. But this idea that I think that the gospel of life invites us then into participating in, and ask ourselves, we learn this as children, right? That we learn how to share our toys. We learn not to always just think of ourselves. We learn, and then there are forces in our world today that might be very resistant to that type of teaching that suggests that, just pay attention to yourself. Don't worry about anything else. And, and then I think that the ability for us to see our participation in the common good begins to become diminished.
yeah,
And in some cases, maybe, I think in some cases, maybe that's what government wants. They don't want us to be actively involved, in sustaining the common good. Right. So, yeah,
yeah. Or the individual good, unless you happen to be a certain kind of individual.
yeah. Very true.
And Bishop, this is what I don't understand. Maybe you can shed some light on it for me. This is genuine confusion on my part. I don't know how it is that we've gotten to the point where we just no longer see the inherent dignity in human beings. I mean, as
Mm-hmm.
Christians, we know that we're all made in the image and likeness of God, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore really deserve respect. But even secularists, I mean, think of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, um, uh, seems to rest upon the intuition that there's something inherently valuable about human beings, such that we have to be treated and we have to treat others in certain ways and refrain from treating others in certain other ways. And it seems to me that to a large extent, that intuition is going by the wayside. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't understand why or
Mm-hmm.
how or even when, but it just scares me to death.
I don't know. Listen, thank you for asking, but I'm not sure I have an explanation. I think we're both kind of speculating both from a human and a moral and pastoral perspective. But I remember when I was in seminary, Cardinal Bernardin created a an experience for seminarians called Common Ground. And it was an opportunity for more conservative religious communities to be in dialogue with more progressive religious communities. And the interesting thing is that we had to stay in a room and talk to each other. And
Mm,
and I do think that maybe from past horrific events in our own history and in our own time. I'm thinking about, the Nazis in Germany. I'm thinking about the eradication, the genocide of the Jews and gays and lesbians. What we discovered, I think, psychologically, that if I can use anti-locution to make you less than a person, then I can do whatever I want to you. And I think the failure for us sometimes is to see the other as person, right? Martin Buber talks about this in I, Thou, right? It is not seeing the other person as an object, or I think as a element of a transactional encounter, but seeing them fully as a person. And I think, Catholic social teaching gives us some real parameters to begin to appreciate that again. It's interesting because I realized just recently, in light of some of the, I think, intimidation tactics of some of the ICE behavior here in New Jersey, that the majority of the people that I see are a member of some form of minority. And so they've been more anxious, and we've been talking about that. But in talking with them about that, what I realized is that they do not feel seen in the fullness of who they are.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
seen either in a dimension of their skin color or their sexual preference, but never are they seen as fully human. And I think maybe that's what we're talking about. Maybe we're trying to invite people again to see the totality of a person, right? So,
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I like that a lot. And to the extent that we learn or relearn how to do that, then it seems to me we can honor another pillar of Catholic social teaching, solidarity. You
Yes,
know,
yes, yes, yes. I think, and by the way, I just was saying this earlier that, sometimes when we don't know what's happening to us, there's an anxiety, and it's an existential anxiety, it's a psychological anxiety. But sometimes, soon as we know what it is, some of that anxiety wanes. Now, what it is might kill us, but knowing that the name seems to help a little bit, right? And so I was thinking about that in terms of what you're saying is that when we can know the other, then we're not afraid of them any longer, right? And then we can honestly get in touch with our own prejudices, our own and but I think in some ways the Catholic social teaching gives us this this framework to stand shoulder to shoulder and understand that at the foot of the cross we all stand on level
yeah,
ground. And the reality is that none of us is going to escape this life in any other way that the rest of the world has, right? And so, yeah. So no, I think that's a very good point, right? But I do think that one of the criticisms that I often make and I often hear is my upsetment with what I think are Christians who co-opt the gospel. And I might be a little bit more harsh in my judgment than I should be, so I have to ask forgiveness for that sometimes. But the reality is that I don't know how one who has arrived at an encounter, a spiritual encounter with God through the person of Jesus Christ can come to understand that what Christ did in his life, in which we are encouraged to model, is anything like some of the denigration of the human person that we see today. Yeah,
agreed, absolutely agreed.
yeah.
If there's one thing, if there's one symbol, if there's one image that it seems to me it represents everything that Christianity stands for, it's the arms of the cross,
Yeah.
which just embraces the entire world. Um, and it's hard for me. I'll make a confession here. It's hard for me to want to include in my community people who may be on the margins of society,
Yes.
people who may not be respectable. Um, but then I have to go to the Gospels and remind myself that that's what we're called to do if we want to live in imitation of the Lord we profess.
Yes. I think there's a there's a gentleman at St. Francis that seems to have adopted us. And I think, as you say, he lives on the margins. And so the parish has been very welcoming and responsive. But it was interesting because, as you say, we need to pay attention to how the experience of being included can be in some sense healing,
Yeah,
right? And I think that's what he finds with us, right? I mean, there's no pressure. You don't have to do anything. You can come. Generally speaking, we like to eat, so there's food after mass sometimes, right? I'm not sure that he's food insecure, but I think the idea of what we had been talking about earlier about communal is this sense of belonging, and solidarity gives individuals that sense of that, right?
yeah.
That when I can identify or I can know something and people stand with me, then I feel maybe a sense of healing and welcome and inclusion and participation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a trick, it seems to me, for appreciating what it feels like to be outside of the group or inside of
Mhm.
the group. There's a philosopher in the 20th century named John Rawls. He writes his famous book called A Theory of Justice, which every undergraduate at one point had to struggle through. And he says, he invites us to perform an experiment that he says, going behind the veil of ignorance. And he
Uh,
says, presume that you were setting up a society and you were the one who were going to come up with rules for that society. But you know nothing about your own circumstances. You don't know your gender. You don't know your class. You don't know your financial circumstances. You don't know anything about yourself. It's a thought experiment. What kind of rules would you come up with, knowing that those rules will apply to you as well?
uh,
And Rawls says, I'll bet you dollars to donuts that one of the rules you'll come up with is to provide a kind of safety net in the
mm,
society that you're structuring, because you could be one of the downs and outs. And if we take that kind of experiment seriously and ask ourselves what it must feel like to be an individual who's outside of the community, maybe we can relate a little bit easier to those people who actually are outside of the community.
And isn't that true, Father Curry? And boy, that's brilliant what you said, honestly, because if we really did think about, so the old Jewish midrash, right, where the two rabbis, and one is asked if he can sum up the whole of the law while standing on one foot. And he's like, oh, that's impossible. That's impossible. And the other rabbi, whose name I always forget, says, yes. And he stands on one foot and he says, what you would not want done to yourself, don't do to another. Right. And that's the whole of the law. And I think this idea that if we were for a moment to, as Martin Buber said, try to experience the other, we would really think about the struggles and how we can alleviate them for each other. Absolutely, that's a brilliant way to look at that, actually, right? So yeah, absolutely.
I've got a friend who's still teaching, I think, college, and every year he takes a few of his students to the streets of Philadelphia, and they live on the streets for a night, and they speak to homeless people, to try and learn something about them, but also to personally experience what it's like to be on a street, great in the middle of winter, when people are looking at you like you're some kind of disease that they don't want any part of.
Yeah.
Now that's the beginning, it seems to me. This empathy, this looking at another as a person rather than an object or an it. That's the beginning of social justice. That's the germ, I guess,
Yes.
I want to say, from which social justice can begin to spring.
Absolutely.
This personal experience.
Yes, yes. It's funny. Our parish supports Covenant House, and they do a sleep out, and they ask the benefactors. I don't think I'm going to do it, but some of our parishioners are doing it. But I do. You listen. I mean, everything feels somewhat in the abstract until it happens to us.
Yeah.
And I think Catholic social teaching perhaps is a way to wear down some of that isolation, some of that. And it is hard. It is, and I agree with you. You and I, maybe perhaps because of our priesthood, our vocation, but I think married couples, I think single individuals, we have to really navigate how we put this belief in these principles into action. And I think the point that you're making is maybe if we really did get to know each other, maybe if we really did kind of engage each other at a different level, not seeing them in their need, or not seeing them in what we assume is they're demanding things from us, but rather as a person, it really changes everything. It really changes everything.
Yeah.
I worked in a restaurant for the homeless when I was in theology and as Franciscan, and we all wore our habits and we served the homeless. And there were 2 menu items. It was called St. Francis Day, but it was wonderful. The city of Toronto actually adopted it in some ways. But we would the people could come, they could select from 2 menu items. And if they could pay something, they could, but they couldn't. And the friar that was in charge, Brother Allen, would caution us sometimes, because I had the expectation that I was doing something great, that I was giving, I guess, from my largesse, right? The people receiving it were not receiving it in the way that I expected. So he said to me, Dorothy Day has reminded us to be careful of the ungrateful poor. And in that, I think that he was trying to communicate that the individuals who are benefiting from whatever it is that we're doing have a sense of insecurity that they may never get this again. And so their needs are greater, but also it's an invitation to see them beyond their needs, right? It's an invitation to see them as human. And I think that's such an important point of what you make there, honestly, right? So yeah.
I had an experience similar to that at Thanksgiving once in a Catholic worker house, and at the time I was furious and hurt. But ever since then, I thought that's one of the best lessons I could ever learn, precisely for the reason that you've mentioned, because what I was thinking I was doing was making a transaction. Yes. I'm going to give this homeless person a piece of turkey, and he's going to just bend over backwards to thank me.
Yes.
What social justice in the Catholic tradition is not about, I would suggest, is transactionism. And
Absolutely.
so when both as individuals but as communities, and that's what we're really talking about, right? If we try to promote justice in the expectation of being rewarded for it or being somehow compensated for it, we're not only setting ourselves up probably for disappointment, but we're not really doing justice.
Right, right.
We're selling largesse.
Yes, yes. And then expecting the other person to somehow assuage our egos for what it is that we're doing, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It is geez, Mother Kerry, we could go on forever in some ways, right? But I do hope that our discussions, whoever they may reach, might invite all of our listeners to think about Catholic, Christian, whatever, think about how our responsibility to each other in society might begin to maybe really in important ways change and help us think about the immigrant, help us think about the person who is housing insecure or food insecure, help us really to maybe have a plan of action of how we want to participate that in alleviating the sufferings of others in some way, right? We talk about that as altruism, and we try to teach that to children in a sense that when they experience that, it gives them a sense internally of their ability to have some agency in their life, right, and to participate, right. So yeah. Yeah, yeah. So before we go, though, I just wanted to, we've been talking a lot about Catholic social teaching and the principles, but we haven't really named them. So I think that most of us will identify predominantly seven. And you and I, at some point, I think, touched on each one of those, although not by the titles that we have come to know them by. But I wanted to just read them off so we would be familiar with them. And also, I just wanted to refer everyone to the website of the United States of Conference of Catholic Bishops. I think the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has written a somewhat a forceful letter to the Conference of Catholic Bishops in the United States, reminding them of Catholic social teaching. And so what I've noticed now is on this particular website, there are resources for inserts into parish bulletins that help form the adult conscience. And
Mm.
so in many ways, they're a re-articulation of some of the things that we're talking about. So I think it was helpful for me in terms of preparation for our coming together, you and I today. But very briefly, the way that that most of the encyclicals begin to delineate the principles of Catholic social teaching are the dignity of the human person, which we've touched on, the common good, which I think we've talked a bit about, solidarity, which is the idea of standing with each other as humans and recognizing our humanity. Subsidiarity, which is that's a concept that that I think functions fairly well in the ANCC. It's a principle that holds that decisions should be made at the lowest possible level by those who's most affected by those decisions, and that higher authority should only step in when that seems unresolvable. And I think that's an important point for us in terms of how we behave that way, right? So, yeah. And then preferential option for the poor. That I don't know that there's any more that needs to be said. Our scriptures shot through with God's preferential option for the poor, right? And the Gospel of Luke certainly presents that in an important, I think, theological lens from the person of Jesus. The dignity of the worker, the dignity of work and workers' rights, especially what we're dealing with in our country today in terms of identifying people who so add to our society by the work that they do that indeed might be somehow diminished or limited. And then the care for creation, the stewardship of the earth. So I think those are the seven principles that, at least when I pray about them and think about them and preach about them, I have to begin to see how am I using them in my own life. So yeah, yeah. I don't know if any concluding thoughts, Father Carrier.
Just two recommendations, if I may.
Yeah.
The last of the social justice pillars that you mentioned, care for the environment, has really gotten a lot of publicity lately. And so I would recommend that if folks want to learn more about it, they might read Pope Francis's Laudate Si. It's a
Yes.
wonderful encyclical on how to incorporate our sense of justice when it comes to Mother Earth.
Yes.
And then my other recommendation would be this little book. I've used it in moral theology classes. It is a wonderful little primer on the whole concept and practice of Catholic social teaching. I mean, I recognize that people don't have a lot of time, given their other duties, to sit down and read encyclicals from 1891 to the present. But this is a really good summary that offers explanations of all of the pillars that you, Bishop, just mentioned, but also gives some really wonderful tips on how to begin practicing them, both as
Nice.
individuals and as members of a community.
Very nice. Very nice. Who's the author, Father?
It's Bill O'Neill. He's a Jesuit, as
Oh,
you would
boy.
expect.
Yeah,
Excellent.
yeah. I failed to mention at the beginning of our podcast today that Father Kerry is the author of a number of books on important figures in the church, but also, I think, somewhat examples of individuals who put Catholic social teaching into practice. And one of those is Bishop Oscar Romero, who Father Curry wrote a wonderful little biography of Bishop Romero. I would recommend that highly. You gave that to me as a gift, and I read it from cover to cover. But it really, I think we do need sometimes examples and models of how to do this, right? So, and then that notion of solidarity, standing shoulder to shoulder with each other, helps. I feel better when I'm in a crowd, right? So, absolutely, right? So, Father Curry, thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and I hope that our discussions are somewhat meaningful for those of you who listen. I would welcome you to offer any comments or suggestions. Father Curry and I, as pastors, are used to being open to what people think we should do or don't do. So we're pretty good at hearing that. And so if you have some helpful suggestions to us, or if you want to comment, we really would encourage you to like and subscribe if you can. And there are 14 of our parishes around the country. You can find them on our ANCC website, which is theancc.org. And you can probably reach Father Kerry and I through that medium if you'd like. But we're always so glad when you listen to us and give us a little bit of space in your life, so that we might bring a particular maybe message of love, healing, and inclusion, which we find at the heart of the gospel. So thank you so much, Father Kerry.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank
All
you.
right. God bless. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.